how does the name of this new Pentagon program, Replicator, strike you?
It scares the crap out of me, to tell you the
Right?
truth.
Honestly. You know what? Maybe we could use a little bit of obfuscation in these names. Just call it, I don't know, the new Good Times program or something.
Right.
Replicator is just like, you're just taunting us with it. So yeah, this not at all ominously named program was announced yesterday by the Pentagon. It is intended to produce thousands of autonomous systems across multiple domains in the next 2 years. They will not say what systems exactly they're going to be producing, but of course, you know, these are probably going to be drones. These are probably going to be unmanned ships. And we are told that we need these systems because they're pretty cheap. And we are going to want them to counter what the Deputy Secretary of Defense yesterday called China's core advantage, in that China has more ships, more missiles, and more people. All of this is about China, and specifically China in the Asia Pacific. And so I want to talk about whether we should be concerned about the possibility of thousands more drones, thousands more submersibles potentially buzzing around the Pacific, potentially even more distance from human decision making than than previous models, and instead relying on AI. And so joining us for this conversation is Michael Wong. He's National Vice President of Veterans for Peace, and he's co-chair of the Veterans for Peace China Working Group. He's also a co-founder of Pivot to Peace, which is a coalition of Chinese and peace communities. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Thank you.
So this program was announced yesterday. It didn't get a ton of attention other than in sort of defense news websites, but the possibility of, filling the Pacific with these autonomous systems and potentially, robots that are using machine learning to make decisions. Should we be concerned about this?
Yes, we should be very concerned. Let me make three main points. First, China does not want an arms race. They've spoken at the UN about this, and they're very much against having such a race in the first place. And my second point is, if there is an arms race, if the United States is foolish enough to force it on China, China will win. And my third point is, these AI, sometimes called killer robots, are a danger to all of humanity because they interact with each other. They could conceivably interact with our nuclear systems, and it risks decisions being made by AI without the oversight of humans or control by humans that would escalate situations out of control. So this poses a great danger to all of humanity. I can go into a little more detail about that. Sang Jun, who's the China representative to the UN, spoke at the UN recently, and he urged the UN to take a lead in advocating for peaceful uses of AI, regulations and rules to control the development of AI, and to direct AI for peaceful use, not for weapons. And he felt that standards need to be made to regulate and control AI. And UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres also said that interaction between AI, nuclear weapons, biotechnology, neurotechnology, and robotics is deeply alarming. And if China were to have an arms race forced on them on AI, China's actually slightly more advanced in some ways in AI than we are. They also are able to mass produce things in general much faster than we are. For example, here in California, we've been trying for over a decade to build high-speed rail just from San Francisco to Los Angeles. We've not been able to do that. China has built thousands of miles of light rail all across the country, networking every major city in China in just about 10 years. So in terms of mass producing anything, China will win if we engage in a race with China. And then my last point is that AI, we're allowing computers to decide things. Just think about it. How much trouble do you have with your computer? Would you trust your computer to make life and death decisions for you? I have trouble with my smartphone auto-correcting my emails and making mistakes and making them wrong.
Yeah.
So do we want autonomous robots, killer robots, out there deciding which humans to kill and when and why? And also, if two automated nationwide systems are fighting each other, they will be geared and programmed to win, which means that if they can't win, they will escalate. And that means that escalation could easily spiral out of control. We could end up in a nuclear war. This is very foolish. There is actually an organization I discovered called StopKillerRobots.org. If anybody wants to go to that website, they can get involved.
I wanted to ask about this. I mean, I think that, there are a couple of different questions I want to ask here. One is that I suspect that a lot of Americans don't understand just how much a potential flashpoint the South China Sea is and how provocative our freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea are to China. And so, the idea that we would like to flood this area. I mean, look, we're talking about a big part of the world and thousands of systems. So maybe I'm being a little bit dramatic when I say flooding, but really they are talking about building thousands and thousands of these systems to deploy to the Pacific to use the quote that you always see, counter threats posed by China there. And so I wanted to ask you to elaborate a little more on, we are already we are already initiating a variety of close calls with China by conducting these freedom of navigation operations in waters that they consider to be theirs or along their border, setting up the possibility of a misunderstanding, right, or a misperception of something that is or isn't a threat in an area that's a flashpoint, in an area that China would consider a matter of self-defense, right? Because we're right on its border. What will it mean to introduce, as you say, not only a bunch more possibilities of misunderstanding, but a bunch more possibilities of misunderstanding, not even between humans, but between robots?
Yes. First of all, for Americans to understand how China feels, just imagine if China or Russia were doing freedom of navigation patrols up and down our course. And when I say freedom of navigation patrols, I'm not even just talking about sending a cruiser or destroyer, through these waters every few months. I'm talking about entire aircraft carrier battle groups, a whole armada of ships patrolling up and down China's coast. And that's very provocative. Just imagine if China or Russia were doing that to us. How would we feel? That would be a very obvious threat. So, Americans, when they read the mainstream news, they hear China's being aggressive, China's being a threat. China is not on our borders. China is not running battle groups up and down our coast. We're doing it to them. They are not doing it to us. And we say, well, we're defending our allies in the Pacific. Our allies are not under threat. China's not threatening Japan. China's not threatening South Korea. China's not even threatening Taiwan. We keep saying China intends to invade Taiwan. Now, China's very clear. They've been saying the same thing now that they've been saying for 50 years, which is we want peaceful reunification with Taiwan eventually, no time frame named, and that we would only consider use of force if Taiwan were to declare independence. The United States keeps trying to push that red line. And if you look at polls in Taiwan, the polls always say a majority of people in Taiwan want to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is working for both sides just fine right now. There's been billions of dollars in trade that goes back and forth each year between the mainland and Taiwan. There's thousands of tourists and business people that go back and forth every year. The economies are thriving on both sides. The status quo is working just fine. So the United States is the one that keeps pushing the red line and trying to provoke a war, just like we did in Ukraine. I've been talking with a professor from Taiwan who's been advocating for a middle way between the two powers. And, he says the same thing, which is that the status quo is working just fine, and nobody in Taiwan or the mainland wants to change it at this time. So there's really no basis for our provocations. And like you say, putting AI in charge of these things risks, the destruction of humanity. Would you trust your computer to make a life and death decision for you in a crisis?
No. It is shocking to me, considering how often we invoke Taiwan and the well-being of Taiwan as a reason for our aggression against China, and how little we actually hear from people living in Taiwan, right? Like, we will hear from the leadership, and especially if they're from the DPP, right, and not the KMT. But we don't hear a lot. I mean, I will give some credit to, I think it was the New York Times that had a long article that included several people saying, well, either I don't want things to change, I think reunification would be fine, or I'm certainly not willing to die for it. And the thing that drives me especially nuts is hearing people look at what is going on in Ukraine and act as though that would be some kind of glorious future for the people of Taiwan, right? A small island that would be absolutely wrecked if we were to have a war on it or on top of it. I mean, it blows my mind that people truly think that that's preferable to continuing to sort of engage and develop and live a normal life in a pretty normal country, right? I mean, of course, Taiwan is in a weird geopolitical situation. China has some, rules that they find onerous about what different international groups it can join and how, what memberships it can have. And it gets, people get understandably frustrated about that. But, is that enough that you want, you want your population to die? You want your buildings to be bombed? You want your sons to go off and die in a futile war? I don't think so.
Right. And polls consistently show that. Mm-hmm. The people on Taiwan do not want to become the next Ukraine. They've been having demonstrations, actually even saying that if it's a choice between reunification or becoming the next Ukraine, they would prefer reunification. It's completely unnecessary. If you talk to the people on Taiwan, whenever you read polls, the polls consistently show that they just want to keep the status quo. It's working for both sides. It's been working for 50 years. It can work, far into the future. Historically, China has, a history of 5,000 years, and there's been different times in history when China was divided between itself, and it eventually reunified. China thinks in terms of hundreds of years, thousands of years. Things don't have to happen immediately. China doesn't feel a need to reunify immediately. They just want to eventually reunify, and both China, the mainland, and Taiwan, the island, have been evolving over time. And if we just gave it time, peaceful reunification is possible, and various compromises and other forms of relationship along the way are entirely possible. There's no need for this. The United States basically is trying to stop China from its peaceful economic rise because they don't want a large segment of the world being not under the thumb of U.S. domination. It's basically exploitation and imperialism of the third world, of which China is still a part.
I also wanted to ask you about the sort of technological implications here. One of the things that is being said about this effort to, build all these thousands of systems quite quickly, it's being stressed that they are sort of cheap, that they're expendable, and I think it was a deputy secretary of defense who said, we are looking at how useful these kinds of cheap, expendable systems have been in the war in Ukraine, and we don't intend to accumulate a stockpile of missiles and conventional weapons that is as big as China's, but these are going to be our sort of counter to that. And I wondered if you have any insights into how the war in Ukraine is affecting our view of what a conflict with China would be like, what it means that we are kind of working on slightly different weapon systems, and whether that should tell anything about, the timeline for potential conflict that the U.S. is looking at.
Yeah, the U.S. elite, especially right now, is composed of people who have a very arrogant and unrealistic view of America and the world. They keep introducing new weapon systems into Ukraine and thinking that that's going to turn the tide of war. And each time they're proven wrong, because whatever they do, the Russians will counter it. And they've proven that they can counter it, and they've been successful at countering it. And if you look at the weapons and means of both sides, it's pretty clear that they can continue to do that. So the elite in Washington, they're losing their dominance over the world. They're getting desperate. They're engaging in magical thinking, quite frankly. They think that they can come up with some new gimmick that's going to win the war in Ukraine, and they're applying that same logic to China, that they can come up with some new gimmick that can somehow defeat China. The reality is we're not up against just China or Russia. We're up against the entire third world, which we've been oppressing for the entire colonial period. So that world is standing up for itself. It's being independent. It's not out to attack us. Nobody wants to invade the United States. But they want to be independent. They want to not be exploited. They just want to live peacefully. And we're trying to stop that because our elite, not the American people, want to continue exploiting the rest of the world. And this magical thinking is very, very dangerous. There's always been talk about pushing the edge of nuclear escalation in Ukraine. And they're doing the same thing with China. They're pushing the edge constantly of escalation. They're introducing new systems. They're getting more and more desperate, and they're engaging in more and more magical thinking, which is extremely dangerous. And once we have all these AI killer robots running around the planet, because not just China, but many countries can develop them, we'll have something that we don't have control of. It almost looks like, the Terminator series of movies that Arnold Schwarzenegger starred in.
I mean, it feels like they are pointing straight to that with just the name of the program.
Yeah,
again.
Even just the name is provocative.
Give me a sort of, this is Operation Steel Wheels or whatever, right? Like Cold Storm, not Replicator. The other thing I wanted to ask, I think it's a good point that you make that, the sort of global South, the sort of coalition of people who are, or nations that are trying to, create their own kind of bloc to counter Western policies that they have found exploit them over decades. As you say, they're not trying to bring war to the shores of the United States. So what do you think American people should understand about our country, about what we're told about our country, given the fact that the way that we are responding to economic competition and, economic decisions that maybe don't exclusively benefit us to the detriment of other countries, that we're responding to efforts like those with, by openly threatening conflict?
Yeah, what I would say to the American public is don't just read or listen to the mainstream American or even the Western news like BBC or any of those. Listen to, read both sides of the story. Go to Chinese sources such as CGTN on YouTube or RT on YouTube. Go to look them up on the internet. Look up neutral sources such as Singapore's CNA news channel on YouTube. Use your internet to go look for original sources, not Western reports on sources, but original sources from different countries, both countries that we claim are adversaries and countries that are neutral, and just read how they see the world and what they see as their interests and their view of American behavior. You don't necessarily have to accept any one country's side, but if you want to have a balanced picture of what's really going on and how each country sees things, you have to read their original sources. You can't listen to American or Western narratives in the mainstream news. It will always give you a very slanted picture and will be highly inaccurate.
Michael Wong, thanks so much for joining us. That was the National Vice President of Veterans for Peace, a co-founder of Pivot to Peace. Can you tell us where people should go if they want to find out more, either about VFP or about Pivot to Peace?
Pivot to Peace is peacepivot.org. That's peacepivot.org. And Veterans for Peace is veteransforpeace.org.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.